If you're into podcasts, you should check out our podcast, Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. It's about cold cases that were eventually solved. New episodes are released every other week. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. Number 3. Killer King. In late 1980, author Stephen King was a well-respected and wildly popular horror writer living in Maine. Having already penned such now-classic novels as Carrie, The Stand, and The Shining, King was making the rounds to promote his latest book, Firestarter, when he murdered John Lennon. At least, that's the bonkers conspiracy theory celebrated by one Beatles fan named Steve Lightfoot. Lightfoot's obsession with proving the author shot the singer began shortly after Lennon's assassination on December 8, 1980. Lightfoot has never really given a good reason why he began to suspect that Stephen King killed John Lennon, other than the fact that 1980 Stephen King bore a passing resemblance to Lennon's convicted killer, Mark David Chapman. But Lightfoot doesn't rest the case on the physical similarities between the two men. On his website, LondonMurderTruth.com, he goes into great detail about how King pulled off the murder and exposes those who helped him cover it up, namely Dick Nixon and Ronnie Reagan. As Lightfoot likes to say, it's true or he'd sue. The key evidence, Lightfoot says, are the hidden codes found in the headlines of major news articles about Lennon before his death, specifically in Time magazine, Newsweek, and the New York Times. These codes, when deciphered, reveal a vast government plot to off John Lennon as payback for his anti-establishment views. In a way, Lightfoot isn't entirely out on a limb here. It has been well documented that the U.S. government had tried to deport Lennon numerous times for his outspoken views on the Vietnam War. But according to Lightfoot, they decided to kill him rather than deal with the deportation. And that's where Stephen King comes in as the supposed trigger man. On his website, Lightfoot meticulously points out sections of interviews King gave before the killing that proves he was going to do it. He even cites what he calls confessions, passages King later wrote in his own books over the years, in which he admits to the crime. Then there's Lightfoot's claim that the author himself reached out to advise him he doesn't know the whole true story. To some, it sounds like another fella using the internet to forward a personal obsession. But Lightfoot has been on the King killed Lennon trip for years before the internet was around. Sightings of his remarkable van, festooned with headlines and messages, were celebrated around California during the 80s, and that's a tradition Lightfoot continues today with a new van and an ad for his website, where he would be happy to sell you a 24-page booklet that would allow the reader to crack the same headline codes he has. It all seems like kind of harmless and bemusing fun. But for Lightfoot, the conspiracy is no joke. Multiple reports have had Lightfoot showing up at Stephen King's book signings and public speaking events, following the author around to heckle him about the murder. Once, Lightfoot even got arrested. He said King in 1994, "Stephen Lightfoot has been a stone in my shoe for a lot of years." But even now, with a new van and a new Stephen King book coming out, it doesn't seem like that stone is going to disappear anytime soon. Number 2. Avril Et Deux. Avril Lavigne was 16 when she signed her first recording contract. 2 years later, in 2002, her first album, Let Go, exploded onto the charts and cemented Avril in pop music history. But, according to one particularly wild conspiracy theory, it was all downhill for Avril from there. As the theory goes, Avril quickly grew weary of the constant touring and public appearances her new fame demanded. It was too much, too soon, and the teenager spiraled into a deep depression. She refused to be seen in public or do interviews and didn't want to be a pop star anymore. But with her album flying off the shelves, the record executives who signed her to the contract were left in a lurch. They had $1 million moneymaker in their pocket, but she wasn't cooperating, so, according to some, the executives pulled a page from the playbook of rock music's past. They hired a lookalike to impersonate Avril, to take over the job, and left the real Avril to herself holed up in her mansion, until she eventually took her own life in 2003, leaving a young woman named Melissa Vandella to assume her life and career. Then, shortly before Avril supposedly died, Vandella was taught to sing and perform like Avril. Vandella was initially hired to be a body double and stand-in for Avril when it came to dealing with the paparazzi. The idea of a clandestine celebrity doppelganger swap is not new. The most famous example of this perhaps being the urban legend that Paul McCartney of the Beatles died in a car crash in 1966 during the height of Beatlemania, leaving executives no choice but to bring in a double of Paul to fill out the foursome. The Paul is dead theory gained traction in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly on college campuses, to the point that Life magazine devoted a cover story to it in 1969. In the article, McCartney himself, supposedly, is quoted as saying the theory was all bloody stupid. The people who are making up these rumors, he said, should worry about themselves instead of worrying whether I'm dead or not. There's not enough time in life. Apparently, there's one particular fellow in Brazil who didn't get McCartney's memo. After the release of Avril Lavigne's second album, 2004's Under My Skin, this Brazilian fan began to notice some peculiar differences in not only Avril's music, but with the singer herself. The fan launched a website called Avril Está Morta to prove a switch had been made. The most obvious difference, the site points out, is how the singer looked, speculating on plastic surgery, and citing sea changes in her fashion choices, going from t-shirts and jeans to midriff-bearing pop diva ensembles. Her voice, as well, sounded thinner than it had on her debut album, the theory states. And the new Avril was taller, thinner, and a completely different autograph than she used to have. In all, the Avril Está Morta website points out dozens of pieces of so-called evidence of this deception. Everything from cryptic song lyrics to media quotes, to carefully analyze photographs and frame-by-frame video analysis, all in the hopes of proving that the Avril Lavigne who still performs today is actually Melissa Vandella in disguise. All so the record company executives could milk further millions from its late cash cow. But what would a juicy conspiracy theory be without a firm denial from those supposedly involved in the secret plot? Well, the legend really got ahead of steam in 2011 and resurfaced with a vengeance in 2019, finally forcing the singer to respond to the quote, dumb internet rumor, unquote. It's so weird, she told Entertainment Weekly, so dumb, and so it seems, complicated as well. Number 1. Radical Purge. It's the late 1960s in America, and everything is on the verge of fundamental change. Young people who picked up the name hippies and ran with it gather in large protests all over the country, trying to put a stop to the war in Vietnam. But more than just stopping the war, they want to be heard. No longer those bucolic grade schoolers from the 1950s, the youth movement of the late 60s truly believes that if they band together, they can change the world. And they aren't alone in this belief. According to multiple biographies and even taped conversations, President Richard Nixon believed these rascally kids might be able to pull it off too, and he wasn't happy about it. So he called in FBI's J. Edgar Hoover to look into his so-called youth problem. Later, he called in CIA Director Dick Helms to do the same. And he called this domestic surveillance program the Houston Plan. Nixon's first target were those he considered spokespeople for this young generation. The entertainer radicals he believed were fueling the discontent in his nation. According to one theory, Nixon, Hoover, and Helms made enemies lists of those in show business who needed to be dealt with. They were hippie icons who spoke and sang about being up with free love and drugs and down with the government. People like guitar god Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix made a name for himself by powering out a rousing rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock in 1969. But by 1970, he got word that the feds were on his tail, so he booked it to London to hide out for a while. But it wasn't far enough, it seems. On September 17, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died of what officials called accidental asphyxiation. They concluded he choked on his own vomit after taking sleeping pills. He was 27 years old. Then, on October 4th, 1970, a mere 17 days after Hendrix's shocking death, with the hippies still mourning his sudden passing, rock and blues icon Janis Joplin was found dead on the floor of her hotel apartment. A staple of the hippie scene in San Francisco, the birthplace of the counterculture movement, Joplin had expounded on the benefits of free love and the use of narcotics to open one's mind to a free way of thinking. According to officials, Janis accidentally overdosed that night in her hotel room. Curiously, she was also 27 years old. Another voice of the youth movement silenced. At this point, even someone clouded in weed smoke would be able to notice the beginnings of a disturbing pattern, especially if one is given to paranoia and a keen distrust of the government. As the lead singer / slam poet for the iconic band The Doors, Jim Morrison grew up with this mentality. After all, he was a military brat, moving from naval base to naval base following his top-ranked father, who, by 1970, was a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. Perhaps with some inside information from his powerful dad, Jim saw the writing on the wall. After recording the Doors album, L.A. Woman, Jim got the hell out of Dodge. He left Hollywood and America and holed up in a Paris apartment with his girlfriend, Pamela. But he was hoping to escape the long-reaching tentacles of Nixon's anti-radical Houston plan. He was dead wrong. On July 3, 1971, 9 months after the deaths of his friends Jimmy and Janis, Jim was found dead in his bathtub. The official cause of death was heart failure, brought on by a heroin overdose. No autopsy was performed. Strangely, Jim Morrison was also just 27 years old. Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison, all outspoken critics of the war and outspoken proponents of the youth culture, all dead within 1 year. It's kind of hard to see how anyone wouldn't see a nefarious pattern in it all. Later, the release of extensive FBI files on all three singers bore out the idea that the feds were keeping an eye on them. Enter filmmaker Larry Buchanan. In 1984, he released a movie called Down on Us that first postulated the idea that the CIA and/or the FBI had Jimmy, Janis, and Jim all whacked, exterminating the three singers whom he called the Pied Pipers of rock. The movie was not well received. The New York Daily News called it, quote, the work of a Martian whose understanding of the counterculture comes from old issues of Life magazine, unquote. But it was apparently intriguing enough to spark a conspiracy theory nonetheless. And as with many intriguing conspiracy theories, other believers took the ball and ran with it. Eventually, this one grew out to add that because Morrison had been tipped off by his dad that the government was after him, he actually faked his own death in Paris and continued to live in France and later in New York, where he still lives today under the name William Lawyer. Either that or Morrison became a Catholic monk and died in a Spanish monastery in 1974. Some have gone even further, joining the red thin of yarn with so-called proof that the CIA created Charles Manson through brainwashing in order to give the counterculture a bad name in the minds of the American public. For his part, director Buchanan firmly believes that the events depicted in his film are true, telling the Phoenix Times in 1991, "It's a true story, absolutely. Nobody has ever challenged anything you see in the movie." and he's happy that at least it got people talking about the very idea of wide-reaching government conspiracies years before Oliver Stone. "We lit the fire," he said. "Excuse the pun." Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.